Good evening, Grand Junction residents and members of the City of Grand Junction Planning Commission. Tonight we have an item wherein the Planning Commission will make a recommendation to City Council on adopting an ordinance amending landscaping requirements applied to site development in the Zoning and Development Code, Section 21.06.040, landscape, buffering, and screening standards, and related sections of the Municipal Code. The proposed ordinance would substantially amend the Zoning and Development Code to adjust how landscaping is carried out in conjunction with private development. We will break it down into the key elements. First, we will look at the existing regulations and understand how they're structured. That essential structure is carried forward into the proposed revisions. Then we will look at the reasons for amending the code, as well as the process that staff undertook to make an informed recommendation. We will dive into the proposed changes, and it won't be possible to succinctly address every minor adjustment made, but we will take a look at the most significant changes in some detail. Please refer to the draft revisions in the packet for this hearing for more detail. We will then conclude with findings and a staff recommendation. The Commission may move to recommend that City Council adopt the ordinance. Let's take a look at how the code currently regulates those landscaping plans. Simply put, the code regulates how private development installs and maintains landscaping. The Community Development Department examines landscaping plans when we process development review applications like site plans or subdivisions. We ensure that landscaping plans align with the code. Regulations have been crafted with the constraints and opportunities that come with that review process. In the long term, we rely on code enforcement to monitor the maintenance of landscapes. Landowners and HOAs must maintain according to their plans in perpetuity. The revision also aims to set the community up for success when it comes to maintenance. The way that the code actually operates is based on three main components. It mandates what parts of a development need landscaping, depending on the zone district. Those areas are then landscaped to meet a minimum quantity of trees, shrubs, ground cover, and sometimes fencing and similar. The code also regulates the manner of planting to a limited extent. The code also comes with a few supplements. We will discuss the suitable plants list in depth. Finally, this section does not operate alone. We will look at the other parts of the Zoning and Development Code that would be affected by this revision. But the other main code section of which to be aware is 8.32. That section on trees primarily deals with trees on public property. No changes to section 8.32 are proposed here, but 21.06.040 certainly does have other relevance to right-of-way trees. These regulations inform how designers create landscape plans. In the spirit of understanding, this is the kind of document that landscape architects produce and that planners review. It looks like the one on the screen, and it comes in with a larger development application. It consists of a detailed design complemented by a list of species. It also has calculations that respond to the code requirements, notes for installation and maintenance, and details that correspond to best practices. This one is for a project that you may remember from the last several years. And here is a picture of a lovely street downtown as a reminder that when these landscapes are planted, they have a massive impact on how the city looks and feels and are made up of living things that require care. That brings us to this question: why landscape? Before we jump into what the aims of the revision are, we also need to understand the relevance of the section. The regulation serves the public well-being. The code section, as amended, would be introduced this way. Quote, "The purpose of this section is to enhance the aesthetic appeal and sensitivity to context of new development, achieve efficient use of water resources, expand urban tree canopy, and contribute to a livable urban environment." This speaks to the core motivation. Landscaping presents a short-term and long-term cost to development, but it also represents an immense long-term store of value for the community and for individual landowners. With these broader motivations in mind, the Community Development Department set out to revise the code with specific goals. The first is to resolve ambiguities in the code. It's intended to be clear without being substantially longer. It should be usable for city planners and for development teams. Next is to align the requirements with the best practices for landscaping. In that respect, we consider planning practice, landscape architecture, horticulture, and other disciplines that all have a stake in landscape design. In an effort to improve planting outcomes for the landscaping code, we also developed a list of suitable plants and prohibited plants. The list has several functions in the proposed code, and we will cover this later on in the presentation. We're also concerned with protecting the city's landscape assets, both on public property and in general. The comprehensive plan makes it clear that the natural environment is an important part of the city's identity. Another essential aim is water conservation, which has been raised in the strategic plan, comprehensive plan, and numerous public contexts by the City Council and Planning Commission. All of these factors inform the proposed changes. To make the revisions, we began with a deep dive into the regulations of other communities in the Southwest, as well as best practice documents from the American Planning Association, American Society of Landscape Architects, and others. We then brought the material to the Forestry Board and Planning Commission for a series of workshops with these appointed boards. We also assembled a task force of 7 landscape architecture, horticulture, and development practitioners for 4 meetings. That task force invested an impressive amount of time in reviewing draft revisions, as did city staff, including the city forester. Through that process, we arrived at the revision before you, seeking a recommendation for City Council. So through this process, what did we come up with? We came up with a code that makes tough compromises across our goals, protecting assets, conserving water, and setting landowners up for success. We will dive into the 6 aspects of the changes, all of which are addressed in the staff report. We'll talk about flexibility, definitions, and protection and replacement for significant trees, alternative landscape regulations for water conservation, the list of suitable plants, trees in the right-of-way, impervious surfaces, and some best practices and practicalities related to the regulation. First, flexibility. Flexibility is an important consideration for landscape architects. The code is, by nature, a reductionist document. It establishes a baseline standard. Every property, though, is unique. The code responds to this mismatch by building in flexibility. The revisions clarify and expand the ability of designers to exchange trees for shrubs for ground cover. It also clarifies under what circumstances landscaping can be proposed to deviate from some of the finer grained specifications of the code, so long as it meets the intent and baseline minimums of the code. It also clarifies the practice of providing credit for retained trees, which we will explore shortly. Trees, more broadly, are one of the most important elements of the code. They are vital to the health of landscaping in the city and to the outcomes that the city seeks. Many changes are proposed that affect trees. To understand the scheme for trees, it's helpful to know that the code discusses, quote, caliper inches of tree, as much as it discusses just trees. A caliper inch is a measurement for tree size. Trees currently need to be 1.5 or 2 inches in diameter, or caliper, at the time of planting. No change to that is proposed. However, the use of this measurement is important to other measurements and treatments of trees in the code. For example, the current code requires a number of trees based on the amount of disturbed acreage in a development. The change would replace that ratio with a caliper inch per square foot ratio for clarity. Trees are also impacted by the suitable plants list, and trees are related to the alternative landscape plan options. As we will see, some minor reductions in tree count are used to complement water-sensitive landscaping regulations, with an emphasis on retaining well-rooted trees instead of replacing them with smaller trees that need more water. That brings us to significant trees. The notion of a significant tree is common to many of the codes in Colorado cities and in large and small metros across the western U.S. The revision would regulate significant trees in GJ for the first time. The proposed definition for significant tree is one with a 15-inch diameter. This is high relative to most other jurisdictions. 12, 8, and even 6 inches in diameter are common measures. Very few communities exceed 18 inches in diameter, or caliper inch. A tree so defined is subject to more stringent regulation when it comes to development per the revision. A developer under the revised code would be required to retain a minimum of 30% of the significant trees on the property. While many properties in the city do not have any significant trees, others may have several. When significant trees are removed, the developer would be required to replace that tree of a rate of 1 caliper inch of new tree per 2 caliper inches of significant tree removed. When such a tree would be retained, it would be rewarded at the same rate in terms of relief from new planting requirements. Thus, a developer with 2 trees that retains 1 tree and removes the other simply breaks even as regards significant trees. The idea is to protect 50-year-old trees, assets that can't be replaced except over a 50-year period, from destruction, and to encourage design to embrace these unique landscape features. Another essential change with this proposed revision aims to make landscapes more water efficient. In particular, staff proposes a strategy that would provide 2 alternative standards for landscape plans that meet certain criteria. The first alternative is a water-wise landscape plan. Any development application could seek approval as a water-wise landscape plan, but it would be required to ensure that a minimum number of its plants, specifically 50% of shrubs, ground cover, and turf, are low water or xeric. The plan would also have a maximum of 25% turf coverage for landscaped areas. In return, a 20% reduction in required trees would be allowed, and shrubs would be allowed to be smaller at the time of planting. A more complex and constrained alternative is also proposed. A high desert landscape plan would be permitted where a site can demonstrate clear geotechnical constraints inability to access irrigation water, or a high desert ecological context, such as might be found in parts of the Redlands, Orchard Mesa, and Book Cliffs planting areas. The plan would also provide for higher standards of water conserving landscape. 90% of plants would need to be designated as low water species for the city's suitable plant list. 50% of shrubs and ground cover would need to be native to the state. A 15% maximum turf coverage would be applied as regard landscaped areas, and a greater proportion of significant trees would be required to be retained. In return, a 50% reduction in total tree count would be permitted. To clarify, both of these routes are optional. It's intended to create flexibility and allow landscape architects to move in innovative directions that align with city policy. Any designer can continue to use the baseline standard. This simply establishes a pathway for constrained sites and designers that are motivated to address conservation goals. I've referenced the suitable plants list multiple times. On the screen is an excerpt. This is a supplement to the code, not an adopted part of the code. This means it could be amended administratively, but is referenced within the code. The code currently provides for the existence of this list, but it has not played a major role in landscape plan review for over a decade. The proposed revision to the regulation would make this list more accessible and provide it with more functions. Its first function is to serve as a menu for landscape architects, especially designers that have never worked in Grand Junction before, and would consist of plants that are recognized to be suitable for the climate in general by the local landscape architecture community. It omits high water use species of tree for the most part, as well as ground cover and shrubs with high water use. It also designates the low water plants for the purpose of the alternative landscaping plan functions that we just discussed. It would also designate preferred plants and trees that are suitable in parking areas, both of which have an important function in the code. The list also includes prohibited plants, limited mostly to noxious or invasive species, but also a list of plants that are likely to be subject from serious disease in the coming years. For example, it will be used to migrate away from the planting of new ash trees in anticipation of ash tree die-offs as a result of the emerald ash borer pest. Finally, the list is intended to facilitate review in a dynamic way. Designers can consult it during design, and planning staff can consult it during plan review. However, the list is dynamic in that if a designer wants to include a plant that's not on the list, that landscape architect can provide staff with adequate information to facilitate review of the species, and plants that are permitted through that process can be added to the list by the community development director. Nearing the end here, this is an important slide, and it steps outside of section 21.06.040, that core landscaping section, into a different section of the code. What we propose here is a change in the definition of lot coverage to directly address impervious surfaces. An impervious surface is a surface that doesn't allow water to infiltrate soil. We want more pervious surfaces in most cases because it assists with stormwater management relative to impervious surfaces. Right now, lot coverage relates only to the ratio of building footprint to lot size. The revision would include other impervious surfaces like parking areas in that calculation. Right now, commercial and mixed-use zones all have a 100% lot coverage maximum. Now, that is currently impossible to achieve because of setbacks and landscaping requirements. So what we propose here is to ratchet that number down by an increment, mostly down to 80% lot coverage, to explicitly provide for a maximum impervious surface and serve as a backstop. This tracks ratios elsewhere in the state, but is on the high side in recognition that it is a change. Finally, a note about plans and practices. Very important note is that, in general, these regulations apply to developments that need to be reviewed by the Community Development Department, not to single-family homes and the maintenance of private property of that kind. Further, we are looking at a continued requirement that landscape plans be stamped by a landscape architect that is licensed in Colorado. We would clarify that minor site plans are exempt from that requirement in alignment with longstanding interpretation, unless required for a specific reason by state law. The proposed revision also clarifies that a requirement for irrigation plans would be introduced into the design and plan set. This aligns with general planning practice, though there may be a short-term deficit in local expertise on designing those plans. We see them as an essential water-sensitive approach, and so we propose that change from a staff level. Finally, we propose requiring notes about long-term maintenance practices in an effort to facilitate care per plan. These changes represent challenging compromises and correspond to an effort to regulate only goal-relevant aspects of landscape plans. We arrive at the recommendation from staff to forward a recommendation of approval of this request with the finding of fact that the proposed ordinance revising the landscaping code aligns with the goals and policies of the 2021 Grand Junction Comprehensive Plan. Staff recommends approval of the request.